Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs, you special SOB. We're going to talk about you because he deserves to be talked about for what he did yesterday against the Raiders. You look at Jahmyr Gibbs' stat line. Yeah, 26 carries. 26. I said that correctly. 26 carries for a $152, 5.8 yards per carry. And there's the next gen little sheet there. It says, all the routes and everything. I love when next gen does stuff like that. And look at that, between the tackles, which is something that people criticize for Jahmyr Gibbs on. He was making plays, explosive runs. Everything we were sold before the draft is coming into fruition. And by the way, one thing I did ask for with Jahmyr, and not just Jahmyr, but from the Lions, for this pick to make sense, for you to draft a guy like Jahmyr at 12, you have to use him as a receiver. That's the selling point for me, Sam Flannel. If he's a receiver, running back, he's an overall weapon, then a lot of people, it's easier to digest the pick. That was it for me, and we're seeing it. Guys, the last, and I just mentioned it last segment, last two games for Jahmyr Gibbs, 15 targets, 14 catches for 95 yards, about 7 yards per reception. He's making plays. You look at his stat line against the Raiders, and this is per Colton Pouncey. Jahmyr Gibbs had more total yards, 189, than the Raiders had offensively.
It wasn't even close.
157.
Yeah.
You heard that correctly. Ja had more yards, total yards, than the Raiders did as a team offensively. Now, you look at some of the other interesting things about Jahmyr Gibbs, and what really impresses me the most is what he's been doing being RB1. Right, you were drafted him. He's a change of pace back. Him and David Montgomery are supposed to be the duo. But this is a guy that, since David went down, has had to step up, and he's answered the call. Last 4 games for him, with David as well in that 4-game stretch. He's averaging 85 yards roughly per game, 5.5 yards per carry, about 15 and a half attempts. And then you look at the passing side of things, or what he's doing in the receiving game, 27 receiving yards about per game. He's doing it all, Sam, and you're seeing it. It's not just what he's doing, it's how he's doing it between the tackles, like I said earlier, the things that people criticized him for during the season. He is finally coming into his own and at a perfect time, right when the Lions needed him.
This may sound like an exaggeration. I may be kind of high off of the win and high off of that great performance. But what I saw last night from Jahmyr Gibbs, that was special. That is the number 12 overall pick. That is a guy that can, and when you're number 12 overall pick, this is your expectation at some point. This is a guy that can be the best running back in the league someday. This is a guy that can have a better career than Bijan Robinson, that could be better than Bijan Robinson this season. And to top this all off, and a lot of you aren't going to like this initially, but just stay with me, especially you, Lucas Klotz. Jahmyr Gibbs is a better running back right now than David Montgomery is, ever has been, and ever will be. I repeat, Jahmyr Gibbs right now is a better running back than David Montgomery currently is, ever has been, and ever will be. Jahmyr Gibbs had 26 carries for 152 yards. David Montgomery has never had a game that good in his entire career. And think about this. Jahmyr Gibbs carried the ball 26 times. Bijan Robinson's season high, 19. Jahmyr Gibbs, 152 rushing yards. Bijan Robinson's season high, 124. That's the thing. Those are the type of games that can completely change someone's perception about somebody, because one of the things that I was upset about with the pick and kind of the discourse surrounding him is nobody seemed to expect this from him. I didn't know if he could do it. I saw flashes of it against Atlanta with 17 carries for 80 yards, and I saw flashes of it at Baltimore when he was really the only bright spot. But what this game kind of did was prove that Baltimore game at the end, that wasn't a fluke. That wasn't when Baltimore didn't care. That wasn't just like when they were ahead 35-0. Those numbers don't really matter. Jahmyr Gibbs was able to do that when they did matter on Monday Night Football in a game in which they really needed someone to step up and somebody to really play big, and it was Jahmyr Gibbs. He was the best player on the field that day. The best player on the entire football field was Jahmyr Gibbs.
Let's watch the Demo slander, though.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
that. My point here is I will agree with you that Jahmyr Gibbs is a more talented running back, but a perfect example of where David Montgomery was an essential player to this team is in the red zone last night.
Yeah.
If David Montgomery is in the red zone, the Lions don't get cute. They're just playing a physical brand of football. David Montgomery probably has 2 touchdowns if he plays last night. And I'm not discrediting Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs was the best player on the field yesterday, but I think it's just kind of weird. It's like when you were comparing Khalil Herbert and David Montgomery. Like, they're just 2 completely different styles of runner. Jahmyr's better explosive back, but if I need to get 5 yards and keep the chains moving, go with David Montgomery every time.
It's apples to orange. It's just not the same. But I get what you were trying to. Like, Jahmyr is the more talented back. I would agree with you there. But Demont and what he can do, those guys play well with each other.
I think
they're good working with each other.
I think after last night, it's fair to call it close, but to say that he's clearly better than David Montgomery right now, I think is a little extreme. But you're going to be proven right on that with time. I'm not going to deny that.
And that's the thing. I guess what I was most impressed with when it comes to Jahmyr Gibbs, and granted, the offensive line did a kind of a ragtag offensive line, did a phenomenal job blocking, and I will admit that 100%. But I love the way that Jahmyr Gibbs was able to hit the holes and then bounce it outside. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how he scored his touchdown. That's how he had another long run at the beginning of the game. And he was consistently getting those 6-yard runs, 7-yard runs, 9-yard runs. It seemed like, if I can recall, there was one in which it looked like he was about to break it, but it was a shoestring tackle. That was just all night, just chunk plays after chunk plays, a long touchdown run. Again, that's, to me, and that's the thing, Jahmyr Gibbs, when you're the number 12 overall pick, you are expected to be this dominant running back. And what I saw last night is somebody that can be the best running back in the NFL in a few years. I never thought that from him. And now I think it might be possible. I'm not calling for it, but I mean, I even compared him to Bijan Robinson. They're basically having similar seasons now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about the whole people, jump into conclusions right when Bijan got his start and he got a ton of workload early on. He was making plays. I get all that. But Jahmyr, it's not about how you start always, it's about how you finish. And Jahmyr Gibbs, by the end of the season, I think the conversation will be, and I love Bijan before the draft, but Jahmyr Gibbs is a hell of a player. And that's really what the most impressive thing is. And they were lining him up in the slot. I mean, he's an all-around weapon. And that's what, for me, makes this pick. When people question it, I'm like, listen, if he's a weapon, I'm cool with it. And you're seeing it. You're seeing it. And by the way, all the injuries they had last night to the offensive line, they lost Coyote. Dan Skipper comes in, did not matter.
Shout out Hank Fraley.
Hank Fraley's a hell of a coach. That's good you brought that up. The other thing is, excuse me, they had injuries to the interior of their offensive line. They had Jonah Jackson out, Frank Ragnow out, Vaitai out. They had subs in all around on the interior. They still ran Gibbs up the middle.
Sure.
And he still made plays. So it's credit to those guys for blocking. But even with a banged-up offensive line, they ran the football. I believe he had like 40-ish yards at half, Jahmyr Gibbs. And then in the second half, when they needed him, you wore down the Raiders' defense with Jahmyr Gibbs.
Sure.
5'9" Jahmyr Gibbs.
Well,
he made those dudes pay. And I know it's the Raiders' defense. They were 24th in the league yesterday, but I don't give a damn. Because if he didn't have a great game, people would be talking about it. So the fact that he did show out and had over 200 yards from scrimmage?
He had 189.
189, basically, almost 200 yards from scrimmage yards? Yeah. That's a hell of a game from Jahmyr Gibbs.
Yes.
Hell of a game.
Yes, and I see a lot of people in the chat who don't they think that I'm tearing down David Montgomery. And I promise you that I am not. But here's the reality of the situation. Jahmyr Gibbs is a supreme talent, and you saw that yesterday. Is David Montgomery a supreme talent? I would argue towards no. I would argue that he's a guy, his ceiling is maybe a top 10 running back in the NFL. Guys, his career high this season, and I know it's kind of misleading, is 1,070. Jahmyr Gibbs, I mean, shoot, he might get it this year if he keeps getting the usage. I know David Montgomery is going to come back, but my point was not to tear down David Montgomery. My point is to say that we should want, as Lions fans, for Jahmyr Gibbs to be the better running back. We should want it to be clear as day at the end of this year. It's not tearing down David Montgomery. I had questions, and I will get on the stand to say, and I might be wrong, of whether Jahmyr Gibbs was going to be great and whether or not he was going to be a star. And after what I saw last night, especially with him carrying the whole workload, getting 31 touches, including 26 carries. And it wasn't like they were all sweeps or anything like that. They were runs up the middle. You saw his vision. You saw his ability to get to the second level and bounce it back. You saw his explosiveness, and you saw his toughness. That, to me, is the recipe for a guy who can be the best running back in the league. I know that may sound a little bit hyperbolic, but let me just say this as well, and this is another crazy stat stat from last night. Jahmyr Gibbs is 152 rushing yards last night. That was the 6th highest total any running back has ever had this year. And out of those 6, Jahmyr Gibbs had the high for receiving yards in those respective games. Jahmyr Gibbs had one of the best performances any running back has had all season last night. And I think that's something that he can duplicate. And I think that's why he is already better than David Montgomery and will continue to ascend.
And I get what you're trying to say, but I guess the way I'm looking at it is, Sam, is the game is slowing down for Jahmyr, so when David gets back, those two are going to thrive together.
They will, and I never said they wouldn't.
And they're different. They play different roles, so it's not even about who's better, who gives a shit. Like, those guys together are going to do big things. Like, they are. Now that Jahmyr even mentioned in the postgame with talking to the media, like, the game slowed down. There's a lot of things that I wasn't seeing early on in the season that I'm seeing now, and that's only going to benefit the Lions. And then you got a big bruiser coming back in David Montgomery. Like, it's going to benefit him. Do you want Jahmyr to get 30 touches a game?
God, no.
No. But the fact that they needed him, and he did that, carried a lot of the offensive workload on his shoulders, and they won on the back, a lot of it in the second half because of Jahmyr, that's a hell of a performance, man. Hell of a performance.
Especially after following it up against how he did in the Ravens last week, because people are going to be like, oh, it's the Raiders' defense, they're terrible, which they are. I'm not going to say that they're not, and it probably had...
But if he struggled, everyone would talk about it.
Exactly, and then he goes against Atlanta Falcons, and he had 81 rushing yards there. And how did he have 83 last week against the Ravens, or was it 83 total yards? I can't remember.
Yeah, he had his rushing yards, I think, was in the, 50s or 60s.
Yeah, so I think he had 83 total yards against the Raiders' defense, which is a majority in the second half. So Jahmyr Gibbs, it doesn't really matter. So that's the thing with Jahmyr Gibbs, to Flannel's point, with how high-end talent he is. A lot of the times, it does not matter what defense he's going to, because if he gets in the open field against anybody, he's going to make them look stupid. So that's why, to Flannel's point, and I'm not agreeing with him just yet, but one day, Jahmyr Gibbs, it could be even by the end of the season, will be better than David Montgomery's, because he's a mismatch on whoever's in front of him.
Yeah, he's a weapon, and he's a guy that I think will cause havoc in this league for quite some time. But let's go to break. When we get back, we'll talk about Ali McNeil, Sam Flannel's guy as well. Yep. He had a big game yesterday. We'll talk about him, the defensive line, the performance.